I believe our next speaker needs no introduction. Polimeni from the soggy part of the country over on the East Coast, where it's warmer but wetter and not nearly as gorgeous outside. Presentation style, do you want us to interrupt you every time we have a thought, or hold some questions till the end?
I think that'd be good, because what I was going to say is that I think bits of this presentation have already been recorded and are online. I think that if you guys want to look up some of this material, I can point you to those resources. But because it's a hands-on workshop, I think I've got about an hour's worth of material that I can fly through. But okay, great. But I think it's sort of more fun if you guys kind of stop me. I like to keep it kind of formal. And also I'd encourage, I'm happy to answer questions as I go. I also encourage other, speakers and presenters to also jump in if they have any thoughts. I'll try to keep an eye on the time so we can kind of keep on schedule. But I would encourage, questions as they come up. I think what you'll see is in this presentation that a lot of the topics that I'm going to cover quickly, you're going to see over and over again throughout this workshop. This is sort of like an introduction, but certainly if there are any sort of burning questions or any kind of questions related to clarification of anything I've said, I think that you can definitely pause me. Do you think that sounds good?
Perfect. Thank you, person. And I'm going to put a hard stop on at 10:15, which is not a hard stop to the online conversation, but we do need biological breaks throughout the day, and so a hard stop at 10:15, I would just put you off the stage. Okay. But just hold that thought and keep going. So we got another day and a half.
Okay, very good. All right, cool. Thanks, Cheryl. So for this presentation, I was asked to talk about pre-processing and analysis. Since I'm the first speaker of the day and of the workshop, I thought I'd also say a few words about basic anatomy of for laminar fMRI. And so let's see here. Do I not have focus? Okay. And before I begin, I also want to thank Cheryl for organizing this awesome hands-on workshop and for inviting me. I think it's a great idea. Yeah. No, this is an awesome idea. So thanks again for organizing this. And so, to kick off, why are we interested in fMRI cortical layers? I like to think of laminar fMRI as study of functional activation within the cortex, with the goal of detecting distinct functional activity in cortical layers and its emerging application of high resolution fMRI. And so we know from invasive animal studies that several cortical layers have distinct functional roles. And so laminar fMRI may be the only tool that we have at our disposal to map out similar functional architecture within humans as well. And so it's also a test bed for investigating the limits of fMRI. This really appeals a lot to engineers and physicists as well. Also an extension, I think, of the previous program used to understand the limits of fMRI by detecting the layout of cortical columns. It's also a technology driver. I think that as we see that, laminar fMRI is really on the forefront of fMRI. As we try to improve our neuronal specificity to interpret these data, I think that these insights can be helpful for conventional fMRI as well. So also, as many of you know, there are known patterns of feed-forward and feedback pathways that are segregated by layer. And so if we can identify which layer is activated given a stimulus or task, this may help us to decipher brain circuitry, which of course is going to be key to understanding brain function. So with this quick intro, why a dedicated talk, or really why a dedicated workshop? There's growing interest in laminar fMRI. I think, as I mentioned, there's a great potential for understanding functional architecture and brain circuitry in humans. If you think about it, this is our only technique that we have available to try to answer these questions. However, it's really challenging from a data processing standpoint. Conventional pre-processing and analysis techniques really aren't appropriate. I think that this is partly because we're really at the edge of being able to detect fMRI changes within cortical layers. We can't resolve layers with any techniques we have available to us today. So we need some clever techniques, clever analysis, clever experimental design in order to isolate activity to within individual cortical layers with our current voxel sizes. And finally, I'm not going to say much about this. I think this will be a big theme of the workshop. But there are major interpretational challenges when it comes to laminar fMRI. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that laminar fMRI is probably like the most challenging fMRI experiment that can be done. Don't mean to stereo. I think that there's a lot of analysis, pitfalls. There's a lot of issues with acquisition we need to be mindful of. But there's major interpretational challenges because, again, we're really at the limits. There's a lot of hemodynamic coupling and spreading across the layers. And so it can be really challenging to infer the underlying patterns of neural activity based on these fMRI signals that we measure. Okay. So with this kind of quick introduction, I'd like to give an outline of this presentation, First, again, because I'm the first speaker, I just want to define a few terms and review the anatomy of cortical layers. And there I'll ask the question, how closely do the various anatomical and functional definitions of the layers agree? Next, I talk about anatomical reference data for high-resolution fMRI. And there I'll ask, how do we delineate accurately the cortical boundaries in the reference data? This is a big topic. I'll spend a few minutes talking about pre-processing that's specific to intracortical fMRI data, although this can be applied to any kind of high-resolution fMRI. And there we'll ask, how do we preserve the high spatial temporal resolution that we have in our imaging data? There's lots of opportunities for introducing inadvertent smoothing into the data. I'll talk a little bit about analyzing fMRI data across cortical depths and cortical layers. These are sort of related concepts, although different. And I'll define what I mean by these two terms. And then we'll ask, how do we localize activation to within individual layers with our current voxel sizes? And finally, I think this presentation would be complete without a few words on cortical depth dependence of the hemodynamic response. And then we'll ask how non-uniform is the hemodynamic response across depths or layers. Okay? So, and again, please feel free to stop me anytime. I'll just go briefly through the anatomy of cortical layers just to establish a little bit of terminology. So as many of you know, from a cortex, is Latin for bark, and most of this bark is neocortex. Neocortex is an evolutionary term. It's evolutionarily most recent. It comprises the isocortex, which is comprised of 6 main layers with a rough common layout. So isocortex refers to the common cortex across the brain. The rest of the brain is allocortex, about 5%, fewer than 6 layers, such as the paleocortex, again, an evolutionary term. Archicortex, also evolutionary term. This is the oldest, such as the 4-layered. Okay, so even though this isocortex that we see, that we're mainly interested in here, has a rough, basic 6-layered layout across most of the brain, there are important regional differences as well. For example, here you can see that motor cortex does not possess a layer 4.
Right, about these 6 layers.
Yeah.
Of course, have like exceptions, as you show.
Yeah.
How established is it that like this is kind of the Polimeni definition of, right? There might be alternative, like so they have 9 layers. Or...
Absolutely, and I'll get to that in the next slide. It's absolutely right. So Renzo is bringing up a very important point, whereas that this is messy anatomy. This is biology. The layers don't necessarily conform to very kind of neat definitions, and you will see that even kind of skilled anatomists will disagree about what constitutes a layer, how many layers there are. So this is a very important point. But the point, and so you may ask, when I say there's no layer 4 in motor cortex, that might be with respect to one definition. Maybe somebody else would argue, and there are papers today. Actually, I saw a paper from Helen Barbas sort of arguing, well, maybe there is a layer 4 in motor cortex. This is, cutting edge neuroscience. People are still debating about whether motor cortex is a layer 4. And so I'm going to point out the complexities here in the biology. And so these regional differences, the point here is that stark differences in laminar anatomy across the cortex. And indeed, these differences are the basis for parcellating the brain, such as the Brodmann atlas, which we'll talk about in a few slides. So as I mentioned, there's various anatomical definitions of the layers of the cortex based on different types of features. Again, isocortex has 6 common layers, but there are sublayers as well, based on cytoarchitectonic features as well as myeloarchitectonic features. Cytofeatures such as cell density and cell size, myeloarchitectonic features such as myelin content and fiber orientation. We typically define layer 4 as the granular layer. This is the location of the small granular cells. Above this is the supragranular layers, below that the independent. And so, as I pointed out, there's many layers as well as sublayers, depending on who you ask. These layers and sublayer definitions somewhat agree, but also somewhat disagree between different anatomical methods, as well as across different anatomists. And I also want to point out that, while we refer to the isocortex in our main interest as being 6 layers, the 6-layered isocortex is somewhat of a unicorn, because any given location in the brain, we're really unlikely to see exactly 6 layers. There are many sublayers as well. The number of layers that can be distinguished varies a lot between areas and differs between different histologies. So I'm just kind of raising the point that there's a lot of complexity here in how we define these layers anatomically. As I mentioned, the differences of the laminar anatomy is the basis of defining cortical area borders, and indeed, it's the basis of defining the concept of a cortical area. Both the Brodmann atlas as well as the myeloarchitectonic atlases are based on differences seen in the microanatomical structures within the cortical layers. So the area borders in many places are really distinct, such as primary sensory, motor areas. I think there's less disagreement And you can see between these two atlases, primary V1, S1, M1 are all pretty well aligned. But as you move out from these sort of primary sensory areas, you see a lot of disagreement between these atlases because the laminar differences between different areas is very subtle and sort of very subjective, open to interpretation. And it's still, I have to say, as a quick aside, it's still unclear what's the best way to define like a cortical area. Again, because a lot of these borders really can get blurred and really subjective. There's even a lively debate as to whether cortical areas are real or if they're just labels. So the point again, I just want to raise the point that there's a lot of complexity, a lot of differences in the laminar anatomy across the brain. So now we know that there's also distinct functional roles of cortical layers and sublayers. Here looking at the visual cortex, you can see here again, there's both lumping and splitting going on. We see that layer 4 is actually subdivided into layer 4A, layer 4B, layer 4C alpha, which is on the magnocellular stream responsible for motion and depth processing, layer 4C beta, which is on the parvocellular stream responsible for form and color. Now in the visual cortex, you see that not only are we subdividing layer 4 into 4 different functional sublayers, actually lumping together layers 2 and 3 because they have very similar functional properties in the visual cortex. So typically in visual cortex, we refer to layers 2, 3. Some people like to distinguish layer 3B. In motor cortex, people like to define layer 5A, layer 5B. So the lumping and splitting varies a lot across the brain. Here you can see another example from visual cortex, layer 2, 3, layer 4 subdivided. There's an interesting feature between two of these functional plots, and you see that in both of these plots, there's no layer 1. Okay, that's because in layer 1, which you can see on the right, is a really cell-sparse layer. Very little kind of functional role attributed to layer 1. A lot of layer 1 is comprised of these horizontal fibers, like white matter fibers, almost a copy of the white matter up at the top of the cortex. So typically layer 1 is even omitted. We're talking about distinct functional roles of the layers. And so perhaps the best known property of the cortical layers, and I'm sure many of you are aware of, is that specific layers are the sites of inputs and outputs along various feed-forward, feedback, and of course, horizontal pathways as well. Many look to this kind of seminal paper from Elliman and Van Essen for this general scheme. What's sort of underappreciated is that this paper was really a meta-analysis. What they did was they looked across many published studies, and based on previous demonstrations that in some areas, forward connections could be distinguished from backwards connections on the basis of the laminar organization, of their origins and terminations. They defined ascending or feed-forward pathways in which the origins were supragranular or bilaminar, in which the terminations went to layer 4. They defined lateral or horizontal pathways whose origins were bilaminar and the terminations were columnar. They also defined descending or feedback pathways in which the origins were infragranular or bilaminar and the projections were, the terminations were multilaminar. And so what they did was, after identifying these pathways, they assigned each cortical area a place within a hierarchy. In other words, what Polimeni and Van Essen did was they defined a hierarchy on the basis of the laminar origins and destinations of the pathways identified between cortical areas. And so while this oil refinery picture is a useful schematic, there are many violations as well, both functionally and structurally of this hierarchy. Recent reappraisals have kind of questioned the idea that a single hierarchy can be imposed across the brain. Again, when you see a theme emerging here, I'm trying to give you a sense for the complexities of kind of simplifying these systems. But the point here is that, while this hierarchical organization is kind of a useful way of summarizing the interactions between cortical areas, we need to take this a little bit with a grain of salt. And so finally, I've talked to you about different types of microanatomical architectures. I've talked to you about cytoarchitectonics, myeloarchitectonics. There's also something that's known as angioarchitectonics, in which we can define vascular layers, and we can actually see changes in the vascular anatomy at area borders. So in the seminal work from Duvernoy defined 6 groups of arteries, 5 groups of veins, 4 vascular layers, including this is vascular layer 3, which roughly corresponds to layer 3, 4, and 5 in cytoarchitectonics. This is a band of very highly dense capillary bed. What's amazing to me about this is that we see that the vascular architecture really mimics, very closely resembles the cell architecture. And what's also amazing is that just like we see that area borders can be defined on the basis of differences in their cyto or myeloarchitectonics, it's also possible to define area borders on the basis of the angioarchitectonics. Here's a cool example just to orient you. This is the calcareous sulcus, the white matter. You see that the V1, V2 boundary can be detected in this capillary bed. We see that the capillary density falls off dramatically at the V1, V2 boundary. You also see this between M1 and S1. So this is both, interesting, good news and bad news. We see that kind of makes sense that the vasculature would adapt to the needs of the vasculature to reflect the underlying kind of functional organization. This also presents us with a confound in terms of laminar fMRI, because sometimes we might expect to see stronger fMRI signals where the capillary density is greatest. We're seeing that in many places the capillary density is greatest in specific cortical layers. So this introduces yet another kind of interpretational difficulty, because the vasculature is so tightly coupled to the underlying functional organization. We need to be mindful of this when we interpret our data. Okay, that's my quick intro. So now I'd like to talk about anatomical reference data for high resolution fMRI. And Cheryl already alluded to this. So in laminar fMRI, we can't resolve activation within specific layers. So we need to estimate the positions of the layers from the cortical boundaries to try to infer the positions of the layers and which layers the fMRI signal is coming from. Therefore, it's really important to have an accurate segmentation of the cortical gray matter. And so this is related to one of the questions. Hey, Tomo. This is related to one of the questions on the sheets. As our acquisitions are increasingly capable of providing small voxels both for functional and anatomical data, we wanted to revisit this assumption that a 1 millimeter isotropic anatomical acquisition, such as an MPRAGE, was going to be sufficient for accurately delineating the cortical boundaries. People thought that based on the curvature of the adult cortex, 1 millimeter should be sufficient. The cortex is about 2 to 3 millimeters thick. Sort of a fair assumption. We wanted to look and revisit this assumption. And so we, also I should point out that indeed FreeSurfer, up until a couple of years ago, you fed FreeSurfer an acquisition sub-millimeter. The first thing it would do, it would downsample the data to 1 millimeter to, because a lot of assumptions in the code were that it's being fed exactly 1 millimeter data. And so we wanted to get past this. We sat down with Bruce Fischel and the FreeSurfer team to make some new modifications to allow Reconal to be able to run directly on these submillimeters. So here's some examples, some reconstructions from some 750 micron isotropic MPRAGE from 7 Tesla using this new high-res FreeSurfer stream. So now that we had this enabled, we wanted to see whether there'd be any advantages to generating cortical surface reconstructions directly from these high-res data. We looked across about 39 subjects. We looked at cortical surface reconstructions generated from the high-resolution 750 micron isotropic data, as well as surface reconstructions reconstructed from conventional 1 millimeter data. We saw some differences. Actually, I was pretty impressed by how well the surfaces sort of matched in terms of the placement. We saw that the surfaces generated from high-res data were a little bit more accurate in places compared to the 1 millimeter data, although this improved accuracy was a little bit regionally dependent. The cortex was mostly thinner when we looked at it in the high-resolution data, but in some regions, the cortex was thicker. Regions such as V1, A1, S1, places with really thin cortex, really heavily myelinated, the higher resolution enabled us to more accurately position the surfaces. This was observed before by Matt Glasser in the Human Connectome project, that the higher resolution seems to be giving us more accuracy, especially in these very thin, heavily myelinated regions. Actually, one other feature that we never pointed out in the paper, but I think it's kind of fun, what you also see here is the insula. It's kind of interesting. The insula appears to be thinner in the higher resolution data. It took us a while to understand why this is. Actually, Cheryl might be interested in this. So what's interesting here is that right below the insular cortex in the white matter, the claustrum, this little strip of really thin gray matter. And with the lower resolution data, exactly, the claustrum was sort of partial volumed into the cortical gray matter, giving rise to a thicker estimate of the cortex within the insula. Once we had high enough resolution, we can resolve the band of white matter in between the claustrum and the cortical gray matter, which gave us a thinner and more accurate estimate of the cortex in the insula.
Maybe I can ask another question.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Maybe you can comment on the fact that your resolution is 750, but your accuracy or your changes that you're interpreting are 250, which is not for small. So I assume there's some partial volume model in there, which assumes certain values of T1 between the different compartments, but it might be area dependent, or is it? I don't know.
No, that's a great question. And so what's remarkable, again, I think that we were surprised to see that FreeSurfer did such a good job. I don't have it in the slide deck, but we also reconstructed a 350 micron data set. Same thing, FreeSurfer, the accuracy in most regions is kind of similar between the 1 millimeter data and the 350 micron isotropic. That's because FreeSurfer doesn't do a binary valued segmentation of the gray matter and white matter. It uses kind of a linear partial volume model. Basically assumes that if a voxel is exactly half gray matter, half white matter, and if white matter has intensity of 100 and gray matter has intensity 15, that the border is at basically an intensity of 75. So we'll place that surface sort of halfway through the voxel. In a previous study, when we evaluated reconstructions from MP2 range and MP range, we found was that FreeSurfer had a scan, rescan reproducibility of 120 microns. which is sort of shocking to us. But again, it's because it has this subvoxel accuracy, some regularization, not so much in terms of priors, in terms of intensity, but priors in terms of cortex and the smoothness of the cortex. And so we do see that FreeSurfer does have sub-voxel accuracy, sub-voxel precision. But yeah, that's a good question. And I think that's sort of a sort of tame, linear partial volume model. We see that in acquisitions such as MPRAGE, in which there's nonlinear partial volume effects. We do see biases in techniques like FreeSurfer, most techniques that assume a kind of linear partial volume model. But yeah, thanks, Renzo. Okay, yeah, so Cheryl alluded to this. So now that we have this capability of going to higher and higher resolution, we wanted to see, what would be the kind of ideal voxel size to acquire. But as many of you know, as we push to smaller voxels, we're going to be sacrificing SNR. And at some point, this can start to become counterproductive. So just to test this idea out, this is work from Natalia Zarinskaya. So what Natalia did was acquired some 600 micron MPRAGEs, and she, at 3 Tesla, pumped it through FreeSurfer. These are nice data, no partial Fourier, like very kind of honest, 0.6 isotropic. And what we found was that, the surface, the recon stream appeared to work, but there are a couple places where we really weren't happy with the quality of the surface reconstructions. At first, we were not sure if maybe there's some bugs in the high-res stream, maybe it really can't handle the small voxel data, or alternatively, maybe it's because we just don't have enough SNR. In order to address this, we acquired 6 repetitions of the 600 micron data, averaged them together, ran this through the high-res stream again, in which case we're much more happy with the accuracy of the surface. So this indicates to us that the error that we'd seen before wasn't due to some sort of intrinsic problem with a small voxel data or with the recon stream. We just didn't have enough SNR in the single volume. And so this suggests that as you do move to higher and higher resolutions in order to capture some of the accuracy in terms of the surface placement from these high resolution anatomical data, just be mindful of the fact that you are sacrificing SNR. And sometimes this can be counterproductive. In some cases, you might be better off acquiring data with slightly larger voxel sizes than the minimum possible in order to get enough SNR to give you high accuracy reconstructions. Oh, sure, Natalia. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm just trying to prove a point here. You're right. I mean, so the question is, for this voxel size, if we went to 7 Tesla, maybe we get a little bit more SNR. I think for 600 microns, it's still a little bit. I don't think you need 6 averages. You might need 3. So the point is that, yeah, this is going to depend on your field strength. This is going to depend on your voxel size. It's going to depend on how long you have to scan. But the point is to be mindful of the SNR losses that you're going to see, whatever, as you're pushing the resolutions, whether it's at 7T or 3T or 1.5T, at some point, even though you have kind of nominally high resolution, the SNR can start to introduce errors in the surface reconstruction. Oh, sure, yeah.
When you're talking about the averaging, that's done prior to the model?
So the partial, yeah, so let me clarify. So the partial volume models are sort of built into FreeSurfer, right? So FreeSurfer, again, is positioning surfaces to try to get them exactly at the gray matter white matter boundary. So that's something that we don't really have access to. That's sort of built into the segmentation method. So the way we average these data together, we average them together as complex values in order to reduce the noise floor, used a robust register that's not biased in one volume. I can give you more details about that if you're interested, but we did pay attention to how best to average these data together because they required over about an hour of scan time. I can give you more details if you're interested. Okay, so MPRAGE. So as we're pushing with our fMRI data to smaller and smaller voxels, and as the quality of our EPI data that we use for fMRI is getting better and better and better, we thought, is it possible potentially to use EPI for anatomical references as well? So here's an example of some high resolution T1 mapping with EPI at 7 Tesla. This is a 1 millimeter isotropic whole brain scan at 7T, about a 3-minute acquisition. It's a very simple sequence. All that we do is we play a non-selective inversion pulse. We read out all of our EPI slices. So each slice gets its own unique TI. And then we repeat, and we play the same non-selective inversion pulse, read out all the EPI slices a second time. But this time we permute the order of the slices. So this time every slice gets a new TI. So if we repeat this 24 times for a 3-minute acquisition, every EPI voxel will sample 24 inversion times with which we can fit T1 recovery to each EPI voxel to generate a quantitative T1 map on this EPI readout. with this quantitative T1 map, we can synthesize images with T1 weighting, such as this MPRAGE, like image shown here on the right. We can then pump through FreeSurfer to generate cortical surface reconstructions and parcellations directly from the 7T EPI data. Now, this approach has been kind of used by many groups now. I think that both in the context of 2D EPI and 3D EPI, I think it's really valuable that we're able to achieve such high quality EPI data that it's suitable for surface reconstructions. So one question that comes up a lot, oh, Cheryl, yeah, maybe you're gonna ask it.
If you leave the scanner without this acquisition as part of your scanning session, you made a big mistake. And that's a very strong statement. I don't want to imply you want to imply it. But like, to me, this approach is, or something comparable, something that gives you just the same. And Brenda's like, I can do something I go.
Oh.
So something that gives, it's not this and something better, something that
Well,
gives visibility more.
I think you're right. And actually, hang on to that comment for just a second. I just want to make a couple more comments and then come back to that. Maybe we can have a discussion.
I just wanted to throw that out there for the very annoying thing.
Yeah, I think you're right. I haven't even told you why it's important. No, but you're absolutely right. The only other comments I want to make before moving on is that people, so why are we going to this effort to generate a T1? Why not generate surface reconstructions directly from STAR API? Many groups have asked me about this. Many groups have tried and failed. It's partly because the T2 STAR images are really splotchy. There's a lot going on the white matter. There's a lot going on the gray matter. They're really challenging to segment. So T1 weighted acquisition gives us much better kind of delineation of the cortical boundaries. Also, I should point out that Sorenzo, for example, naturally has these T1 APIs, because this whole sequence is based on T1, and so he sort of naturally has these acquisitions. I should also point out that we did try this at 3T just to see if this trick would work, and we have enough SNR for this trick at 3 Tesla as well. And so now the question comes up, so why is this important? Why are we doing this trick? Why are we generating surfaces from EPI data? Not just because we can, but because the idea is that one of the most challenging issues we face with laminar fMRI or any high resolution analysis is as Cheryl had said before, the registration of the functional data to the anatomics. There's differential distortion between the two. Obviously there are ways to remove that distortion, like acquiring a field map, top up. And if you have looked at these, scrutinized these corrections in detail, will know that they don't always work. In fact, in my hands, it's really very, very difficult to get a really accurate field map. And so there's a lot of, like sleepless nights, about how do we align the fMRI data to the anatomical reference. And so this strategy, I think, is really, valuable, because what it does is it gives us an anatomical reference that's exactly distortion matched to our fMRI data, because we're using the exact same EPI readout. Okay, so I wouldn't advocate using this method. We're doing morphometric analysis. We're looking at changes in cortical thickness. Because it's EPI, the anatomy is going to be distorted. But that's the point. It's distorted in the exact same way as the fMRI data. It helps me sleep better at night. And again, it gives us only because the EPI data is today of high enough quality that we can generate these surface reconstructions directly from the EPI data.
Question about the undistorted image based on the field map. So you mentioned it's difficult to acquire. But it's
difficult to get accurate.
Yeah, but the E0 field is always very smooth.
Well, it's very smooth at a high level. It's amazing if you scrutinize. If you're looking to get sub-millimeter accuracy, what's amazing is that if you look at a high-resolution field map, you'll see little disturbances around blood vessels themselves. The blood vessels that are filled with deoxyhemoglobin will actually also cause very local distortion fields, especially around the sagittal sinus. And so it's not just about the spatial resolution of the field map, so that is a concern. If you wanted to get 750 micron isotropic field map, that's going to take a long time. We also see that as you try to make those field maps faster and faster and faster, there's more and more bias that's introduced into those field maps. And so I think it's kind of an open question as to how to acquire accurate enough field maps for sub-millimeter accuracy. But the point is the conventional field maps work for conventional data. I think there's a lot of issues with getting this accuracy for laminar. Okay. Another interesting point is that, as many of you know, most of the distortions in EPI is along the lowest bandwidth direction, which is the portion phase encoding direction. As we go to smaller voxels and thinner slices, the bandwidth along the slice-length direction is also starting to get lower and lower. We're starting to see there's lots of distortions in the slice-length direction as well. So just to visualize these distortions, we implemented a sequence that's similar to some NP guides have all used in the past. When you use the top-up method, for example, you can reverse the polarity of the phase encoding direction. Here we did the same thing. We reversed the polarity of the slice select direction. If you go from a positive to a negative, positive, negative, you can kind of see how much distortion there is along the slice select direction as well, millimeters. Okay, so you can use this sequence to do top-up-like techniques in order to correct for those distortions. You can also get a field map and correct for these distortions. Again, that's really challenging. The idea here is that if you can acquire an anatomical reference that's matched both in terms of the distortion along the phase encoding direction and in the slice direction, again, these distortions are automatically accounted for using this strategy. I also should point out that no matter how you try to unwarp the EPI data, this unwarping is going to cause resolution losses due to interpolation. So this is a map of the effective smoothing induced in the data by the unwarping. It doesn't matter if it's using a field map or using top-up. That's because unwarping the image requires interpolation on the voxel grid, which causes resolution losses. They're going to be a function of the voxel sizes. Note here also that the pattern of the resolution loss is somewhat resembles the B0 field pattern. Again, this would occur whether you're using an explicit B0 map or by a technique like top-up. So if any of you have an idea, actually only about 3 people so far have been able to guess accurately why this pattern resembles the B0 map itself. If any of you have, come talk to me afterwards. Again, we're seeing this because the voxel shifting on the image grid requires resampling and therefore blurs the data, okay, in a spatially varying way. Yeah, Lars.
Is it really a resolution loss, or isn't it guided in these areas where you have not homogeneity, not a nominal resolution?
Yeah, so maybe, yeah, that's a great point. There's other sources of, yeah, I mean, so the imaging resolution, which I'm not talking about, the imaging resolution is also spatially varied due to T2 star relaxation effects. You're absolutely right, EPI. So here what I'm talking about, not, absolutely, you're getting distortions. You can also have voxels being stretched apart. Actually, that can be favorable depending on your phase encoding direction. If you do posterior to anterior, the frontal cortex gets nicely stretched out, even more resolution. No, you're right. So I'm not talking about the imaging resolution due to compression expansion, due to T2 star decay. We're also hoping that we're accelerating enough that we're kind of getting a handle on at least minimizing these distortions. The point is, here's a resolution loss that's not attributable to the image acquisition process. This is a resolution loss that you're doing to your data during pre-processing. And I think that we really can't afford to lose resolution. We're always operating right at the limit. We never have voxel sizes that are smaller than what we want, right? We always want smaller. And so if we're introducing resolution losses due to these poor choices in the analysis, that's a shame. And not only are they losses, but they're spatially varying. Depending on which brain region you're looking at, you might be really fooling yourself in terms of how much resolution you have. So the point here is that one way to get around this issue is to, rather than unwarping the data, to acquire anatomical reference data that's exactly distortion matched to the fMRI.
So I'm loading your color bar and your estimating.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yes.
Spatial autocorrelation. You could do that. What we did was we cheated, so we did Monte Carlo simulation. So we did was we took IID white noise. We generated like 1,000 samples of this 3D noise volume, just pumped it through the unwarping. We know that if there's no resampling, that the standard deviation of any voxel in the grid is going to be unit, because we put in unit standard deviation noise. Any deviation from unity tells us how much blurring. So it's detailed like that. Yeah, so
your unwarping process applied to IID noise produces this.
Exactly. There's lots of ways to do it, but I kind of thought this was the kind of simplest and easiest to interpret. We do this all the time.
Actually, I would also probably just my data. I looked at my data before I unwarped it, and after I made like a racial map of those two. It would look something like this.
Yeah, exactly. I think it should be very similar. I mean, again, in these regions where you're seeing very rapid changes, it might be a little bit more challenging. So whereas this kind of Monte Carlo type technique, I think, can get it more accurate in places where spatial smoothing itself is varying quickly over space.
Maybe I can.
Oh, sure, yeah. I guess Renzo first, and then yeah.
Maybe, do you have maybe some ideas how to, like this is a post-processing problem, and do you have a solution how to maybe minimize this on post-processing?
Yeah.
Maybe upsample the voxel.
Yeah, exactly. So I pointed out that this is a function of the voxel grid. As Renzo has mentioned, the amount of smoothing that's introduced is going to be a function of the voxel size. So as the voxel grid gets smaller and smaller and smaller, the resolution losses also get smaller and smaller. So what you can do is upsample the data. But the problem again is that you have to be a little bit careful about when you do this because, of course, you're upsampling the data. This can cause, you can fill up your hard disks very, very quickly. So Randy Buckner, for example, what he does is before he applies any transformations, he upsamples his data to 0.5 millimeters isotropic, just to minimize the smoothing induced by this preprocessing step. He's filling up, raids and raids and raids for the data. So I think that's a nice idea to avoid this. I think that one can also just kind of sidestep this problem altogether, by acquiring anatomical data that's distortion matched. Although I'm going to say in a few minutes that this isn't the only source of interpolation losses in the data. So there are ways in which we can at least minimize these effects, but we can't eliminate them entirely.
Yeah, question. One question related to the EPI.
Yeah.
On the FreeSurfer T EPI, you also have the smoothing effect on the basic encoding direction. But that can I also say that this resolution loss is matched to the functional data?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So again, so as Lars had mentioned in the acquisition process, yeah, there's going to be some blurring, some distortions, but the blurring and distortions in the anatomical reference will be identical to those in fMRI data.
Another thing is the T1 weighting and the T2 star weighting are going against.
Yeah.
Some contrast combining the two. But
Well,
if you are quantifying the T1, then
well, yeah, that's going to affect the CNR, but the point is we're doing a quantitative T1 map. By looking at these inversion recoveries, we see all of the signal changes that are attributable to those inversion pulses. So it's not that it's a T1 weighted acquisition. We're generating this T1 map. And then once you synthesize T1 weighting, kind of leave out the T2 star component. We simply take that T1 map that's again free of any T2 star effects using a block simulation, kind of simulate an MPRAGE. So we're actually cheating. We can actually generate a T1 weighted image that doesn't have this T2 star weighting that's sort of counteracting the gray-white contrast. Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so let me keep going. So I want to say a few words about pre-processing, and again, how do we preserve the spatial temporal resolution? And I've already showed you in the previous slide how B0 unwarping can cause resolution losses, but there's lots of transformations that can cause similar resolution losses, such as when you try to correct for the distortion introduced by gradient nonlinearity. And so as many of you know, gradient nonlinearity is a function of the gradient coil, a function of head position within the gradient coil. So God forbid, if you're ever comparing data across different sessions or different scanners, or even within a session, if the subject's head moves a lot during the experimental session, it's really important to correct for these gradient nonlinearities. The spatial pattern of resolution loss also kind of matches with the pattern of nonlinearity in the data. In this particular SC72 gradient coil, we see that regions in the top of the head have the least amount of additional blurring introduced by this unwarping process. So yeah, M1, S1 are going to be less blurred, in this gradient coil. Whereas sadly for some of us, V1, PCC regions in the bottom of the brain are going to suffer from some resolution losses due to the unwarping process that's used to correct for this gradient nonlinearity. But the problem is virtually any time you touch the EPI data, anytime you perform any transformations in the EPI data, this is going to introduce some interpolations which are going to be associated with resolution losses. And the patterns of resolution losses are going to depend on the transformation that you're applying. So for example, a very simple head nodding by 2 degrees is also going to introduce this sort of pattern of resolution losses, which you see on the inflated representation. Head shaking by the same amount introduces resolution losses with a slightly different pattern. And so what can we do? Well, the problem is that in general, we have multiple transformations that we want to apply in order to correct the data. Typically, these different transformations are applied consecutively. So for example, if we want motion correction, EPI distortion correction, gradient nonlinearity correction, we apply these 3 resampling steps consecutively. Each one is interpolating the data. Each one is going to be causing a high degree of blurring. The good news here is that because these patterns are slightly different across the different transformations, they kind of like cancel each other out. So you get a high blurring, but it's sort of overall kind of spatially uniform. This is with a kind of low order interpolation, such as a bilinear. If we go to a higher order interpolant, such as a spline interpolation, we see that overall the smoothing gets a little bit better, although it becomes a little bit less spatially uniform with these higher high order interpolants. But a strategy that I think is a better approach that's been advocated by the Connectome project and paper Glasser and back is what we do instead of applying each transformation consecutively, mathematically compose all the transformations that you're going to apply to the data, and then apply this once. So there's a composed transformation, a single resampling, which introduces less blurring, although becoming a little bit more spatial. I think the bottom line is getting back to Renzo's point. You're going to have to interpolate the data at some point. There's no getting around it. I think no one here is going to skip motion correction. Interpolation issue. So your best bet is to use higher order interpolations, to go to finer voxel grids. But I think that what's really important is to at least go to the extra effort, impose the transformations in order so that you're only interpolating API data once. Yeah, you can exactly. You don't have to do these other ones. You can acquire anatomical reference. You can skip the gradient linearity. You can kind of avoid all these other types of interpolations. But still, with the motion correction, you are going to introduce. You kind of have to. I mean, I've seen people play games in which they kind of, again, you can deform the anatomy if you know the distortion of the API data and you want to do explicit distortion correction. Rather than removing the distortion from the API, you can apply the distortion to the MPRAGE. That's a nice trick. I've seen people like literally move the mesh around as the, when they estimate, the motion during the run. But still, you're interpolating the API data onto the mesh. So there's always going to be some interpolation. You're always going to be transforming the data in some way or another. And so you're kind of kicking the can down the road a little bit. There's always going to be some interpolation applied to the data. And the point here is, as you start to be mindful of these interpolation effects, as Natalia is saying, you can think of ways to minimize these issues in your data. But I think the point is to be thoughtful of this. Cheryl had alluded, what the good news is that it's pretty easy to estimate these patterns. So if you know your transformations, you can estimate the patterns and make sure that you don't get a big splotch of resolution loss in your area of interest. Okay. I should say this is important for laminar fMRI, but this is important for any kind of high resolution acquisition. And again, it's been advocated by the HCP. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about analyzing fMRI data across depths and layers. And so in laminar analysis, our first step is to sample the fMRI signal across cortical depths. And so we need to take into account the different levels of intercortical vascular anatomy. We can see this really nicely in this Karun cast from the CAC-1. Of course, we have these pial veins that on the cortical surface that drain deoxygenated blood from large cortical domains. We also have these ascending venules perpendicularly. These can be the cause of coupling of fMRI signals across layers. These are really important for laminar fMRI. Similarly, the descending arterioles can be the cause of coupling signals. So we need to be thoughtful of this vasculature. Of course, what we really are interested in is the capillary bed, so it's randomly oriented here within the parenchyma. So fMRI signals are going to be sampling across different depths, different layers. We're going to be sampling from different levels of the vascular hierarchy. As we sample across depths, we're going to be sampling from different vessels. We just need to be mindful of this. We're expecting to see different couplings of the fMRI signals as a function of depth between layers and different contributions across layers, also as a function of cortical depth. So in order to perform this first step, we need to compute cortical depth for each voxel. Here's an example of what I like to call a surface-based cortical depth analysis. We generate a segmentation of the gray matter, compute a mesh of the gray matter white matter surface and evolve that mesh out to the pial surface, saving intermediate surfaces across the cortical depths. In this case, it generated 9 of these intercortical surfaces plus the 2 boundaries, the cross-section shown on top of the MPRAGE. And here we're just going to identify EPI voxels that intersect each of these surfaces. So in this analysis, we generate 1 surface model per depth. In this example, I placed them at equally spaced from the depth, from 10%, 20%, 30%, and so on. I'm just showing a couple of examples here. This enables us to perform cortical depth analyses over large expanses of folded cortex. We're no longer limited to locally flat patches of tissue. So just to go through this quickly, just to demonstrate this idea, we ran an experiment a few years back in which we designed a visual stimulus to elicit a pattern of activation in the sequence letter M and V1, sampled it across depths, looked at the pattern. We saw that the spatial pattern sampled near to the white matter surface, the fidelity was actually pretty good. Again, we're avoiding those large pial vessels at the surface. This is using our gradient echo fold. As we progressively sampled this pattern closer and closer to the pial surface, we saw that the spatial fidelity of this pattern broke down systematically as we sampled closer to those big vessels on the surface. One of the lessons here is that spatial resolution of fMRI doesn't seem to be easily characterized by a zero mean point grid function. And a lesson for this workshop is that because our vessels are small, we're becoming much more sensitive to the local details of their vascular anatomy. We also looked at how the signal change varied across cortical depths. We saw about 1.5% activation near to the white matter, about twice that, a 3% signal change near to the pial surface. This laminar profile is very similar to what you see with a gradient echo bold. Why does it look like this? Why do we see this sort of now? It's because the signals we're measuring near the surface represent sort of an integration. We see that these vessels on the surface are draining blood from the entire parenchyma. So what we're seeing is like this integration of activation at the pial surface. We also looked at the spatial variability of the percent signal change across the cortex. We saw was that near to the white matter, the percent signal changes were all kind of small, again, about 1.5%. Near to the pial surface, we saw both big percent signal changes and small percent signal changes, a lot of variability. We think it's because of the spatial heterogeneity of vessel sizes on the surface. On the surface, we have both big vessels and small vessels. The pial surface isn't just large vessels, there's capillaries there as well. The pial vessels are actually kind of sparse. And so this broad distribution of vessel sizes may be the cause of the spatial variability we're seeing in this red curve. So this shows us that this variability tells us that the laminar profiles are really going to vary a lot from one location to the next, especially near to the pial surface. And the variability between profiles is going to be highest, again, for gradient echo, close to those big vessels. So the profiles reflect different vascular contributions to gradient echo bold signal across the depth. Now, as a quick aside, I'd like to think of these analyses, while we originally tried to use these analyses for kind of laminar profiling, I think that they're actually a little bit better for looking at columnar systems. I like to think of them as being analogous to the histological technique that people would use in the 80s and 90s called physical flattening and tensional sectioning. So what they would do is, sort of heroically peel off the cortex from excised tissue and kind of press the tissue between two plates of glass really gently, kind of physically flatten the cortex. And then somehow, heroically, they would tangentially set the cortex. It's shocking to me. The tissue is so delicate. It's kind of shocking. Only a few people in the world can actually do this. And with this technique, they were able to look at these columnar patterns, again, as a function, visualizing 2D ocular dominance column or xenostract patterns as a function of cortical depth using this tangential sectioning. This is kind of analogous to what we're doing with the fMRI data. Rather than physically flattening the tissue and cutting it, we're kind of cutting through the cortex with our surfaces to generate these 2D patterns of cortical depth. And indeed, we can use these techniques to look at ocular dominance columns in humans as well. Of course, we're not the first people to look at this. Cheryl and Issa have been looking at these for many years. Issa mostly, maybe. Okay, yeah, so Issa, as everyone knows, was looking at this a decade ago. But the point is that with these small voxels and surface-based analyses, we're able to see these columnar patterns for large expanses of the cortex. We no longer need patches of tissue. Again, what's cool is that we can exploit the high sensitivity of gradient echo bold by sampling away from those big vessels on the surface to see these really subtle features in the columnar architecture. Okay, so what are the problems with this surface-based depth analysis? Well, we know we have irregular meshes. These meshes are triangular meshes. The density varies with depth and with curvature. So as I mentioned, the surface-based depth analysis, our white matter meshes probably get out the gray matter interface. This can cause bunching of the vertices, especially around sulci. This was pointed out in a nice paper by Kendrick K. One way to correct for this is to perform a density correction. Again, when the fMRI data are predicted off these meshes, this is what sampling biases that Kendrick tried to quantify. Another computationally expensive solution, kind of similar to what Renzo had mentioned before, is to just dramatically upsample these surfaces so that they're so dense that these issues can melt away. That's really, kind of a sledgehammer approach. Another solution was a kind of elegant solution was proposed by Valentin Kemper, in which he also was looking at the irregularity of the distances between neighboring vertices and these polygon meshes, FreeSurfer. He looked at replacing the triangular mesh surface with a lattice or grid, or what I like to call a square quadrilateral mesh, where the density of the vertices is more uniform. This technique is implemented in brain voyager, again, getting rid of this potential kind of bias due to the fact that the vertex density is varying systematically across depths and across the folds. So another issue with this kind of surface-based depth approach is that if you consider the voxel grid superimposed on our family of interpointed surfaces, any given voxel is going to be projected on and this is going to act to kind of smear out the activation when we generate cortical depth profiles using this approach. So I think a better approach, so while I think this technique is really good for visualizing 2D columnar patterns as a function of depth, not ideal for generating laminar profiles. So another approach would be to do away with these intracortical surfaces, array voxel, identify its centroid in 3 dimensions, and calculate the distance of that voxel centroid to the bounding surfaces in order to assign to array voxel a cortical depth. So just to show you the differences in laminar profiles between the surface-based depth analysis and what I like to call this voxel-based depth assignment. Here's a fun example looking at profiles of visual noise across depths. I want to draw your attention to the blue curve, which represents the variance explained of the resting state fMRI data from the retro I-core regressor, which contains cardiac and respiratory noise. You can see that if we use a voxel-based depth assignment, and we see that the percentage of variance explained decreases very, very gradually as we sample closer to the pial surface. That's because with a surface-based depth approach, we're kind of smoothing out the profile across depths because any given voxel is going to be projected onto multiple cortical depths. If we instead look at the exact same data using a voxel-based cortical depth approach, we see that there's less smoothing along the depth dimension. Here you can much better see there's like an L-shaped to this curve. You can see that much better. You can see the transition between regions where near to the white matter, where the retro I-core regressor is more dominated by kind of white matter sources, and places near the pial surface where it's more dominated by CSF noise sources. So the surface-based depth profiling can smear activation across depths, and I think you're much better off with a voxel-based depth approach. So we've been talking about depth profiles, and so in laminar fMRI analysis, you may be thinking that we're doing something really kind of fishy here. Right? Maybe this is the most important slide. We're doing something, we're examining profiles of fMRI activity across the cortex, which is 2 to 3 millimeters thick. And if on a good day, we have millimeter data, maybe barely sub-millimeter. So how are we dividing the cortex into so many cortical depths with so few voxels across the cortex? So this idea was kind of explained nicely by Peter Koopman. So what Peter did was he looked at an MPRAGE just as like a test bed, just to kind of explain this idea of how we generate these laminar profiles. So if you consider all of the MPRAGE intensities across the green line, which is nice and parallel to the voxel grid, and if you look across cortical depths, I think he used like 100 different cortical depths, sampled the intensities across the profile. You can see that the cortical depth profile of this MPRAGE intensity is only about 6 or so unique values, right? We're only seeing 6 or so kind of unique intensities as we sample the MPRAGE from the white matter to the pial surface. We see these sort of transitions that are spaced apart based on the voxel grid. Now, if you take another contour based on this red line, which is oblique to the MPRAGE voxel grid, you see a slightly different profile, right? You see that in this case, maybe instead of 6 unique intensities, maybe you see 7 or 8 unique intensities across this oblique profile. And the transitions between these intensities occur at different cortical depths. You can start to see where this is going. If we start to combine or average together these profiles across many, many, many locations, all of these blue contours that Peter drew up with the MPRAGE, we see that the average of all these profiles looks much, much smoother. The idea is that because the transitions between these unique intensities occur at different cortical depths, the averaging kind of gives us a much smoother profile that better reflects the average intensity of the MPRAGE across depths within this ROI. Okay, so I like to think of this as being akin to what's performed in event-related fMRI, which the hemodynamic response function can be estimated at high temporal accuracy, even the long TR or temporal sampling interval, by jittering the stimulus onset and acquiring many trials. So again, this is what we're doing with laminar fMRI in order to sort of infer what's going on across cortical depths, even with voxel sizes that are not small enough to sample these depths at any one location. Now, this is making a pretty strong assumption. Right? So when we generate these laminar profiles, this is really helpful. It allows us to kind of estimate what a profile would be if we had infinite resolution. Also helps us to reduce noise. But it assumes that all voxels at any given depth within this ROI have the same intensity or activation across the layers. Okay, that's a pretty tough assumption. And we need to be mindful of this. So because of this assumption, I should also point out that this trick wouldn't work. If we had a really small ROI, of course, if our ROI was 1 y, this trick also wouldn't work if the cortex were exactly flat, right? Then the averaging would also give us an aliased pattern in this laminar profile. So this works because we have a large enough ROI to sample across the folds of the cortex. But this is a pretty strong assumption. So the natural inclination with this assumption is to use as small of an ROI as possible. This is problematic because you want to be average noise out. You want to be generating a profile that's representative of a large region of cortex. Another problem is that you can introduce sampling biases if you use an ROI that's too small. So just to demonstrate this, here's a very small ROI in visual cortex here. if I look at the depths that are sampled within this ROI, we see that there's a very uneven distribution. The histogram of depths sampled in this ROI is non-uniform. We see that there's a lot more contribution from voxel sampling near to the pial surface in this example, also a big contribution from voxel sampling near to the laminar surface. So the laminar profiles generated from this ROI are going to be sort of biased to the undue influence from the pial surface and laminar surface because there are more voxels within the ROI they're sampling these depths. Yeah.
Like, and what voxels are being, or is this using your depth profile where you have
The latter. Yeah, so this is using the voxel-based depth analysis.
But this obviously depends on the bin size, how many layers.
Depends on the bin size, depends, yeah, exactly. How many bins, I mean, obviously, if you go to more and more bins, it's going to be even worse. If you go to a smaller number of bins, it's going to be smoothed out a little bit. Yeah, but I think no matter what, in this case, gosh, you always going to get some bias. If you divided this up into 3 bins, you still see kind of the pial surface and close to the line matter. But yeah, the point is, it's a very good point. I mean, these are decisions that we need to make. What's the right bin size? How many depths do we want to divide up into? How many depths do we think we can get away with? Yeah, it's a question I don't really have an answer to. I think it's going to depend on the questions that are being asked. But I just want to point out that it's not only going to depend on depths on the bin size, rather it's going to depend on the size of the ROI. As we go to larger and larger ROIs, we see that the distribution of depths that are sampled within this ROI gets flatter and flatter. We go to this really large ROI that's about half the size of V1, you see that all depths are sort of sampled uniformly. So again, the idea here is that there's a trade-off, like how big of an ROI do we pick? How many bins do we choose? These are all trade-offs, that are going to be balancing between variance, the larger the ROI, the more noise averaging we're going to get, and bias. So yeah, bias, variance, trade-offs all over with these analysis techniques. So now when we generate these depth profiles, we hope that any given layer is positioned at a fixed depth so that this pooling of profiles across the ROI will average activations within layers. Unfortunately, this mapping between cortical depth and cortical layer is really non-trivial. Since layer positions and thicknesses vary as a function of the folding pattern. This was seen kind of classically. We see is in gyri, the lower layers are expanded, in sulci, the upper layers are expanded. What this means is that in gyri, kind of layer 4, indicated by green, is pulled up towards the pial surface, and the sulci is kind of pulled down. I like to think of this as exaggerating the curvature of layer 4. This was seen again classically by Monaconomo, as well as by Bach, who went one step further and proposed an equi-volume principle based on a mechanical argument that could potentially be used to estimate the positions of the layers based on the cortical geometry, which is relatively easy. So we can exploit this potentially in order to predict the positions of the layers and how they vary across the folding pattern. So the Leipzig group went and implemented this equi-volume principle to try to predict positions of the layers, and they first compared it with other techniques. They started off by looking at calculating the position of layer 4 using the classic Laplace solution. They compared the prediction of layer 4 to the layer 4 that they could see in their very high resolution ex vivo data. They saw that the Laplace solution, which kind of minimizes the curvature of layer 4, really does a poor job at predicting the location of layer 4 that they could see in their ex vivo data. Okay. Again, it's the opposite of what I said in the previous slide. The anatomy shows us that the geometry or the curvature of layer 4 is sort of exaggerated by the folding patterns. The Laplace solution kind of minimizes that curvature, so they really don't agree. We also looked at the equidistant, so-called equidistant approach, in which we assume that layer 4 is at a fixed sort of relative depth across the folds. Not exactly what we saw in the previous slide, but not a bad assumption. They looked at the prediction of layer 4 based on the equidistant approach. They assumed layer 4 is at a fixed depth. They compared that prediction to layer 4 that they could see in the ex vivo data. And the agreement was better than Laplace, but of course not perfect. And so then they went and estimated the position of layer 4 using this equi-volume principle, which again, proposed by Bach, which they implemented in software. And they found that the predicted location of layer 4 using the equi-volume approach did a much better job of estimating the location of layer 4 that they could see in their ex vivo data. Okay, so the idea is that the hope is that if we generate these depth profiles based on equi-volume spacing rather than equidistant spacing, we're more likely to properly average together fMRI activations from the same layer, and we create our cortical profile by pooling across this ROI. So now this anatomically inspired equi-volume estimation, again, best. It's the approach that's used. I think it's used in the majority of fMRI studies, laminar fMRI studies today. Maybe 50%. I'm just statistically, I think this is used quite a lot. I think it's kind of an elegant idea, but yeah, Natalia. Oh yeah, so it's complicated. It's hard to describe, but yeah, the point is that you kind of dilate, distances as a function of local temperature. Yeah, so it's a little bit hard to explain, but yes, it is possible. Yeah. So again, the question is, how do you combine this insight? If you wanted to do a voxel-based equi-volume approach, yeah, it's a little bit more complicated, but it's doable. Oh my gosh. Oh, okay. Okay, I think 5 minutes. Okay, all right. Okay, well maybe I'll just wrap up this section, and if anyone wants to hear about depth-dependent yeah, I think I can wrap this up in 5 minutes. All right, so I'll switch gears a little bit. But the point is that this group mentioned in a subsequent study that the equi-volume approach is expected to perform better than this equidistant approach, which is really simple, as voxels get smaller and smaller and smaller. I do think that this approach should, in theory, work better. Here's a comparison of depths computed from the equidistant approach versus the equi-volume approach. This is a moving back. You see the two toggling. What's amazing is that, yeah, you can see that the cortical depth estimates vary a lot between these two methods, especially in places where the curvature is really high. Places where the curvature is flat, such as the bank focus, you see that the two approaches pretty closely agree. And so here are some cortical depth profiles that Renzo generated using both approaches, using his sub-millimeter CDV data. And the lesson here is that for these data, which are sub-millimeter, the depth profiles that you generate from these two approaches look basically identical. Right? Even though we have some reason to believe that the equi-volume approach should be better, it seems that with today's voxel sizes, the two approaches give us pretty similar profiles. Now it's going to depend on how curvy the cortex is, where you're generating these profiles, of course. But the point is that while we expect the equi-volume approach to be good as we go to smaller and smaller voxels, maybe for today's voxel sizes, it's not so much a big help. We also know that, it's your data, so please do. Yeah.
So if you think about hands-on and how to do this equi-volume, maybe it's important to note that, as you say, it amplifies the curvature, so it's really sensitive to noise of the segmentation.
Yeah,
noise is super amplified. So given that they look so similar, in practice, it can be really advantageous to use equidistant.
Okay.
Like in FreeSurfer, you have very smooth surfaces, so you don't have the problem. I guess that smoothness comes with the price too.
Oh, okay. That's a great point. That's a great point. Yeah. So the point is, yeah, this could potentially introduce some instability. This can introduce some variability. No, that's a very good point. Okay, very good. All right. So I'm going to buzz through a couple of slides here. All I want to point out here is that as we're trying to estimate positions of the layers, not only do we need to account for the fact that the positions of the layers sort of vary as a function of folding pattern, the positions of the layers really vary a lot between different cortical areas. And for really the basis of how we parcellate the brain, how we define cortical areas, there can be discontinuities even between V1 and V2. The layer positions, can be discontinuous at these area borders. So in V1, layer 4 might be 40%, and V2, layer 4 might be at 30%. And so for every different cortical area, the positions of the layers can vary. You can see this in both cell density and in the myelin stains. So this mapping between depth and layer can vary quite a lot. So when you're performing a laminar analysis on only one cortical area, it's not such a big deal. But when you're comparing laminar fMRI activations from multiple cortical areas, even adjacent areas, this becomes an important issue. Okay, I'm going to buzz through this. All I want to say is that the layer thicknesses vary a lot across different cortical areas. You can see how huge layer 4 is in V1 compared to adjacent V2. Even though layer 4 is pretty big, it's pretty much the largest layer that we can see here. It's about 500 microns. This tells us that, again, we're not going to be able to resolve these cortical layers. In order to resolve activation within layer 4 even, we would need 200 micron voxels, which are pretty far beyond what we can achieve today. And if we sort of normalize the layer thicknesses by the cortical thickness, you can see again how much more layer 4, for example, occupies in V1 compared to other areas, which is again another potential cause of sampling bias. Maybe I'll try to wrap up by talking about another way to potentially align. I said to you that you can try to predict, where the layers are based on the equi-volume approach. As Renzo pointed out, this can be challenging. We know that the equidistant approach is an approximation, is not expected to hold. So recent work, well, maybe not so recent anymore, by Pierre Koopmans, what he tried to do was try to align the cortical profiles using some information from the anatomy. So he first looked at the profiles using the equidistant approach. He looked at the baseline bold signal, so the T2 star weighted intensities. He saw there's a lot of variability of the intensities across the. What he did then was he adjusted the profiles. He basically stretched the profiles out and squeezed them just to try to align the intensities across this ROI. And once he did this alignment, he saw that he could much more easily distinguish this little dip in the T2 star intensity right here, expected around layer 4. And once he did this alignment, he could generate these beautiful plots in which he could see activation, very strong activation within layer 4 in V1 in response to very simple visual stimuli. So I really like this idea. Again, it sort of gets around the issue of, Oh, yeah.
Peter is my old supervisor, and we kind of debunked this.
Yeah, well, I have to say, well, I think the issue here is the potential for circuitry. I think, so the point is, so Peter in the paper, he said, oh, this is baseline, and you start. Well, yeah, the circularity issue is problematic. I think that if you had an anatomical data set, in which you can really see layer 4 very distinctly and use that as an anchor point to align your profiles, I think that's a really nice idea. If you use this approach with the fMRI data itself, there's some, it could be problematic. Am I done? How about 2 more slides and then. Okay, very good. Okay, very good. And I think that, I think this is going to end up this section. And so as an alternative to generating laminar profiles, we can examine the spatial patterns of activation within the cortex, in which case layer-specific smoothing can be helpful. So we can use this framework of intercortical surfaces to perform anatomical smoothing in small voxels, family of intercortical surfaces. If we have some prior that the activation, just the same prior, the assumption that we're making when we generate a profile. We're assuming that activation is the same within layers across an ROI, we can perform layer-specific smoothing. If we have a different prior, we have a columnar activation, we can perform columnar smoothing, we can intercortical smoothing. And again, this framework allows us to perform these sort of anatomically restricted smoothing. So it's making the same strong assumption that we make when we generate these profiles. And here's another nice example from Renzo, if you don't mind me borrowing all these plots. Again, in the unsmooth data, you kind of see the two. Right? You don't need it's not generating a profile, it's visualizing the pattern of activation. You can kind of see the 2 peaks, but when Renzo performed this kind of anatomically restricted, kind of within layer smoothing, you could better kind of visualize, see the 2 peaks of activation within motor cortex across days. And I think the really important point here, and the reason I really like this figure is that when we do the smoothing, we're imposing a prior, right? We're imposing a prior on our data. And so it's really dangerous. You could potentially smooth noise and see 2 bumps. So it's really important, the smoothing can be helpful. It can help you to see patterns that you can see in the raw data and help you see them more clearly. But it's really important to always look at the unsmooth data along with the smooth data to make sure that your prior isn't kind of introducing any features into the data. And with that, I am going to end. I'm going to move ahead and just some conclusion slides. And if anyone wants to see more about kind of the hemodynamics changes across depths, I'm happy to show you. But just to wrap up, I've shown you how new pre-processing approaches can avoid smoothing and respect intercortical anatomy by performing these within layer smoothings. I've shown you a lot of complexities in the mapping between cortical depth and cortical layer because the layer positions shift across a folding pattern. I didn't show you, but the hemodynamic response does vary across depth, which is another source of bias, and it's coupled asymmetrically across layers. So these downstream effects that I sort of alluded to early on. I think there's a need for tools for analysis that are integrated into common software packages. I think standardization can be helpful. I mean, I think that's sort of antithetical to what a lot of us like to do, which is build our own tools. But I think that some sharing and some standardization will help promote reproducibility. one kind of parting thought, in principle, laminar fMRI analysis, is very easy. Like all you have to do is kind of sample the activation across layers and see what happens. And gosh, you always see something. But I think the interpretation is very, very challenging because of the vasculature, because of our limited understanding of the neuronal responses. We're really at the edge of kind of neuroscience. And I think that's really not worked out what the neurons are really doing. So it's really tough for us to be able to interpret the data. This is very challenging. Open questions, I can post this later. 3 recent issues in Neuroimage on this topic, lots of great review articles. I encourage you to look these up. I can also post this later to anybody who's interested. And sorry for going a little bit over. Thank you guys for your attention. Thanks to Renzo for the animations. And thanks,
So I'm going to insist on
Yes.
humans, but I do not want to, how can we do that and have a good conversation? And it's going to be a long day. So we need a snack, but it's going to be a long day. While you're talking, I've made a list of about 8 things that I felt like were mandatory minima for what a good pipeline should include. My list in reacting to John's talk. So now we're gonna, okay, there we go. Take a break. Half of us don't need to leave the building if they don't want to. I can tell you where the restrooms are. Secret, they're like through the doors around the corner and then through the other doors, but you can get to the restrooms, water without going back to take your coffee break. There will be refreshed coffee and hopefully a larger selection of snacks available. Half of you are going to go over there and stay over there and play on the scanner with Renzo. Half of you will come back to this room starting at 10:30. You know full well we're going to slide a little bit on timing and start getting out the computers and start getting onto the data. And that will occupy the next hour and a half of our lives. We'll have lunch break, switch, but in there, I will float back and forth, John will float back and forth, and we will have these free-ranging conversations while somehow still also respecting this. It'll work. So how are we going to decide who's an A group and who's an B group? I could just like stand here and split the class down the middle, and if you feel like you're on my right, then you're in the A group. And if you feel like you're on my left, you're in the B group. And if you feel like, yeah, I don't know, but you just bounce with me. Does anybody have a better plan? Everybody's gonna do every single thing. If you look around and you find it, it's like 12 and 8. So A group will find refreshment and end up meeting Renzo and me and Luca in the main lobby, just because that's the space you can get to and then head back to the center. And B group will take a break, do whatever you want, and find yourself back in here to meet Tim and me. Got you. So we'll float, we'll figure it out, the timing will flex. Go for it. Do you know where you're going, what you're doing? All right, figure it out.
Sure.
I'm